We require such an immense unity to everything around us that we are an expression of that. As Alan Watts would say, like an apple tree apples, the earth peoples. We back with another reflection on the TDV, that Daily Vedantic. And today's reflection, I don't know where that voice came from, but it reminds me of Last Man on Earth, I think. What a great, underrated TV show. Okay, so that has nothing to do with the reflect. Actually, maybe it does. We'll see in about 5 minutes, because it might have something to do with the third myth. But the three myths, modern myths. Ram Dass would often talk about the modern myths of our culture, the ones that we all buy into. Last episode, yesterday, I talked about the gospel of more, and that is tied to one of the myths. More is better. More is always better. That episode yesterday will go into that wayward thinking, but today's episode, relatedly, I wanted to talk about some of the other myths, the modern myths of our culture that Ram Dass touched on in a lecture decades ago that's just so beautiful, and how he touched on these modern myths and how we all imbibe. Drink from the same fountain that these myths are absolutely the way it is. The first myth is the myth of success. The myth that we collectively buy into so often is this myth that success, succeeding in life, has to do with an external pursuit, with financial milestones hit, with an accompaniment of all of these things you've collected, from cars to family members. Speaking of, you can hear my little daughters out in the backyard. But this is a myth. Chasing these things that we think are symbols of a successful life have nothing to do with what we really want. A successful life is attaining peace and prosperity within. That's not a big stretch. That's not some big philosophical concept, though Vedanta is very clear and says what you really want, what we all really want, is peace and prosperity, and we want both of them. We don't want one for the sake of the other. We don't want prosperity but no inner peace. We don't want inner peace but this constant feeling of lacking, of feeling without. We want peace and prosperity. Peace is a function of, does your understanding supersede your conflict? Or you can have that hard conversation peacefully because you know the understanding is on the other side of that hard conversation is bliss, is growth, is development. Is that other person's growth, development, and your understanding supersedes your conflict. It's like conflict on one level is peace on another. Our white blood cells, if they don't do their job, if they don't go pursue that conflict, then you don't have the peace of health. Prosperity, and we touched on this yesterday. Prosperity is, do your means supersede your desires? And if they do, super simple equation, crazy simple. If your means supersede your desires, well, nice. You got prosperity. You can either get there by elevating your means continually or by decreasing your desires. It's your choice. One happens to be more in our control than the other, but that is the myth of success. That success is in material wealth, is in titles, prestige, is in the minds of others. Success, a successful life, is one that can only be measured internally. The second myth, and just as pervasive, maybe even more nefarious, is the myth of the separate self. This myth that I am separate from my community. I'm separate from my family. Separate from the university I'm going to, and I'm going to be an automaton little robot. Like I've got to outcompete everyone because this whole university is for me to use for my own personal gain. And that's how maybe you end up with a decent grade and a good degree, but a whole host of enemies or lack of community. rejected from your community, even if you have personal achievement. A rejection from community that then trickles down into who hires you or who will work with you, who vouches for you, who will protect you when shit hits the fan. That's just logistics around the myth of the separate self. The spirit of this myth is that your happiness is for you to attain through the use of everyone around you. They make you happy. That's the phrase we use. You make me happy. You are a tool, an instrument that I want to keep around because this is your utility. You make me happy. And as we touched on a few days ago, that's one of Kant's cardinal sins. One of the most critical errors we can make in life is to view others as instruments for our own selfish well-being. And that stems from the myth of the separate self. Because just like the truth about success is almost in the exact opposite direction, the truth about our role is that it is only a function of our environment. Our peace, our prosperity, those are only functions of where we fit in to the whole. They can be nothing other than a function of where we fit into the whole. The myth of the separate self is like the myth of a separate finger. Cut off a finger and see how well it thrives on its own. And yet we use this language, these concepts that, well, you've got 10 fingers. On each hand, you've got 5 fingers. A linguistic convention. We act like it's anatomical, but it's just language that we say those are separate things, fingers. And yet anatomically, this is true. Anatomically, there is no distinction, point of distinction where one finger ends and the other begins. There is no distinction. There is no separation anatomically, scientifically, medically, where one finger ends. We don't know where that point is. And yet, linguistically, conceptually, we say that's your finger. Those are your 10 fingers. That's your index finger. That's your middle finger. That is Tommy. That's Sarah. That's Jane. And yet you take Tommy, you put him in space, maybe last 90 seconds without the environment, down to the exact air pressure that you or I or this fictitious Tommy needs. We require such an immense unity to everything around us that we are an expression of that. As Alan Watts would say, like an apple tree apples, the earth peoples. Vedantically, you'd say the universe peoples. In the same way that apple is an expression of the apple tree. This finger, this hand is an expression of my communication. You and I, we are expressions of the totality. That's just on the terrestrial realm. This plane that we're on right now, that you're listening to me speak, that I'm speaking into this microphone, and one layer higher on the absolute plane, we're not just an expression of the universe. Who we really are, what this philosophy says is who we really are deep down, is that ground of being, is that universe, is what is the divine, is the supreme. Whatever language we want to try to throw at it. Because ultimately it can't be defined. As is said about the divine, a God defined is a God confined. So it cannot be defined what we really are. And even Vedanta will say that. This is just a pointer to what we really are. Existence itself manifesting in this illusion of plurality, in this myth of the separate self. This myth of the separate self in the midst of unity. And spoiler, the intro to the episode, it doesn't actually have anything to do with the episode. But if that hooked you, if that got you to this point, maybe you'll stick around for this last myth the myth of control. This is a big one. This is a big one in our lives. This myth that if we can line things up just perfectly, we can control the outside world. Set the thermometer. Get the house just right. Get the spouse, the kids, and we're going to be able to control the outside world and our own inner happiness through the control of the outside world. It's not just the myth of control, it's also the myth that if I control the outside world, that's where I'm going to find that inner state of bliss, peace, happiness that I'm really searching for. But that's the myth. And I don't mean this in the capital M myth. None of these are the capital M myths. Joseph Campbell famously brought reverence to the capital M myths that have so much truth within them. Joseph Campbell also was secretary of the Vedantic Society of New York for, I think, 2 or 3 years. So, fellow Vedantin. But those myths that have truth, capital M myth, that's not what these are. These are lowercase m myths. And that myth of control, the truth is, you can never control what's outside of us. You can think you can push back waves for a few minutes, maybe an hour, and the waves will end up winning. So what can you do? As I think it was Emerson. It was either Emerson or it could have been Samuel Johnson that said, you can't push back the waves, but you can learn to surf. Could have been Washington, actually. But whoever said it, I think it was George Washington, said you can't push back the waves, but you can learn to surf. And what they're saying is this eternal truth that you can't control the outside world, but if you can master yourself. That quote was a joke, but the Muhammad quote of the greatest jihad is the conquest of oneself. That's real. The conquest of oneself, the mastery of ourselves, that is the greatest of all battles, the greatest of all pursuits. And if you can do that, and you not only don't get exhausted trying to push back the waves, but you love riding them. You crave them. Instead of shirking from discomfort, you see it as a chance to serve others, to surrender into a duty or responsibility that younger you might have seen as uncomfortable, but wiser you see as, man, that's gonna be a really fun wave to ride. The myth of control. Paradoxically, it is in losing this illusion of control, this juvenile delusion of control, detaching from that, understanding, looking it right dead in the eye that I do not have control. I have no control of what's going to happen. Circumstance, series of events. By losing that myth, the myth of controlling the outside world, all you're left with is trying to manage, master, control your inner world. That's where you start to get footholds, make a little progress. And recognize that with 1/100th the energy, trying to control the outside world, with 1/100th the energy, 1% of the energy, you not only can control your inner world, but it has all of these outer world, these external implications, where the waves are still coming, but you're cruising, laughing, smiling, having the best afternoon of your life. The outside world is still doing its thing. You've just reoriented your approach to the outside world. There still is no control in the outside world, but you've reoriented your inner world to knowing that, to really knowing that. As Socrates said, philosophy is a preparation for death. It's preparation for the unknown. You look it dead in the eye, you prepare for it. You recognize, instead of putting it off or shoving it under the rug and never thinking about it, you look right at it. The fear, the control that it has over you, The waves of fear that previously hit you and rocked you, they start to dissolve. Or you start to ride them and recognize, yeah, I do have a limited time on this plane of existence. I'm going to make every moment count. Instead of electing for the delusion of, death isn't, I'm not going to die. I'll live forever. And wasting our time. So interesting and paradoxical how just something like preparing for death amplifies life. Letting go of control of any external outcomes, events. Detaching from any fruits of our pursuits, our labor. It is so paradoxical, so wild what that does to our inner peace. The thing that we are chasing, trying to get everything right in that external world, ultimately to give us that inner peace. You get it through detaching from those things, not from gripping it tighter. Those three myths, modern myths that dominate so much of our approach to life. The realities right beneath them. That is today's reflection on the Daily Vedantic. We'll see you next time.